Я ухожу.
И в сортире их замочим, в конце концов.
Свобода лучше, чем не свобода.
Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань.
Welcome to Infocom. In the new episode of Focus on Russia, our guest is Maximilian Hess, who is a fellow at Foreign Policy Research Institute. Mr. Hess, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to discuss today some energetic and economic aspects of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So my first question is, how would you evaluate the effectiveness of the latest wave of Western sanctions against Russia? What have they already achieved, and what kind of long-term effects we can expect?
Great. Well, thank you. And on that framing that you give, I think it's important to understand this conflict as both Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a global economic war between Russia and the West. This expands well beyond sanctions, but sanctions are the crudest, bluntest, and most easily digestible tool for understanding it. What I think is often misunderstood about sanctions is that people look at sanctions and they say, these are supposed to change what the Russian regime is doing, or they're supposed to change who's in power in Russia. So they view sanctions either as a coercive tool to change policy, or they view sanctions as a regime change tool. I very much disagree with this framing personally, and I see sanctions within that scope of larger, what we call geo-economic warfare, as really instruments aimed at limiting Russia's state capacity. So when one looks at proponents of the sanctions regime on Iran or on Cuba in the United States and the wider West, the reason why they're happy with these sanctions being there for, at least in Cuba's case, decades, and in Iran's case, on and off for at least 30 years, is because they believe that these sanctions have lowered the capacity of those states, so they're not threats. So the ultimate effectiveness of the latest Russia sanctions, or even the entirety of the Russian sanctions package that have been passed and enacted since Putin invaded and vastly expanded his invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, is really about limiting Russia's state capacity. So we shouldn't expect major changes in Russia's policy or all of a sudden a withdrawal from Ukraine or Crimea or elsewhere as a result of them. So one has to measure their effectiveness in that scale, on that scale. And I do think we are seeing them having a real major impact. Russia's own economic tools of leverage that it's using to push back include gas. But over the long term, the aim is that these will limit Russia's state capacity. As we see now with the conflict on the ground in Ukraine, it looks increasingly likely that a quagmire will set in even before winter. There won't be any major changes in the lines of control. And there it becomes paramount that the sanctions remain throughout so that they limit Russia's ability to renew its military, to spend, to resupply for another attack on Ukraine, which is clearly Putin's aim. If it does end in a quagmire, as we saw in February, he aims to either completely topple the government in Kiev and install a puppet regime, or seize all of the territory east of the Dnieper River and on the coasts, including Odessa.
Yes, so one of the other aspects I would like to discuss is the problem of Europe's energy dependency on Russia. We see that Russia tries to instrumentalize this dependence, Europe's dependence, to achieve some political goals. And it is already obvious that Russia's plan is to wage the war until winter, and whereas this serious energy crisis in the coming winter, try to achieve some consensus from Europe. So I have two questions regarding this issue. Will Russia's policy be successful? And if not, what are the realistic alternatives for Europe to diversify its energy and gas imports?
Great. Well, just to quickly summarize, as you mentioned, Europe has had historically a lot of dependency on Russia for energy. And now one of the real mistakes, as I see it, in the post-Crimea world, post-Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, was actually a doubling down on this dependency from certain corners of Europe in the hopes that it would lead to moderation in Russian policy. So we saw that in particular from Germany, but also in France and in Italy and a number of other European governments. So this included the approval of Nord Stream 2, a new gas pipeline that would bypass Ukraine. Although there were efforts to diversify away through the Southern Gas Corridor project, bringing ultimately Azeri gas in through Georgia, Turkey, and then into the Balkans. However, the Russians have been fighting back on that front as well to keep their dependency, and also arranged a deal with the Turks in 2016 to build their own new pipeline, which has since opened, Turkstream, which kind of undercuts the raison d'etre of the Southern Gas Corridor strategy, because it brings Russian gas in there as well. Oil dependency has also been quite significant. The perhaps most egregious example is Rosneft, the Russian state oil company, despite being under sectoral sanctions on debt financing, was allowed to buy Eastern Germany's largest oil refinery, at least a large stake in it, and then had agreed a stake to buy almost complete control before this current evolution of hostilities. So I think there had been some real failings and differences in European policy on how to achieve this. Now, you've had other issues also affect Europe's dependency, particularly looking at countries like the Netherlands and elsewhere that have been looking to diversify and change their gas supplies. The Netherlands has a very, very large gas field called Groningen that has had a lot of local opposition because it has caused minor earthquakes that have damaged houses. So although this field could produce more than, and had until 10 years ago, produced more than a third of what is currently imported from Russia, it's currently slated to go offline at the end of the year because the local opposition is very strong and the Dutch government has a very fragile coalition. So has been unable to push this through. But we've also seen Russia push back. So one example is in Bulgaria, where an anti-corruption government had come to power last year after 3 snap elections and had been pushing to take a relatively anti-Russian position and pro-Ukrainian position that previous Bulgarian governments hadn't taken, had been one of the first to cut off Russian gas and said that it would buy other gas supplied by Azerbaijan and then Turkey, as well as ultimately via liquefied natural gas shipments to Greece as well. But that government has since collapsed, of course, with many allegations that Russian oligarchic and kleptocratic influence was there. So, really to summarize, I would say Europe's own internal political economies have weakened the ability and to push back over the last 8 years. There hasn't been the requisite understanding of the threat, and therefore there was a failure from a large number of European politicians, Angela Merkel, of course, being the one that springs to mind mostly. And then finally, that Russia is also an actor in these games and can use its own leverage and influence in numerous ways. We've seen that through a bunch of the purchasing mechanisms. It's turning on and off of gas flows through Nord Stream 1 and the like. So it is very much keenly aware that the time to use the gas weapon to its ultimate effect in terms of European politics is now.
Yeah, in one of your recent pieces, I think it was the foreign policy piece, you rightly noticed that although the European Union signed a new gas agreement with Azerbaijan to double the gas imports by 2027, Azerbaijan actually doesn't have the capacity to double its exports. So doesn't the European Union understand that? What was the point of signing this deal if that the deal is practically impossible to implement?
Well, I would push back a tiny bit on impossible, and I would say instead very unlikely. Azerbaijan could export this amount of gas to Europe if some of the following circumstances were met. One, some of the offshore gas deliveries prove more promising than they have until recently, so the discoveries, the ongoing exploratory work, that seems unlikely. Two, if an interconnector with Turkmenistan can be built to bring Turkmen gas across the Caspian Sea, Russia would have a veto over that under the Caspian Sea Treaty, and I also think it's highly unlikely. Another way would be if Turkey buys a lot more Russian gas and then can ship Azeri gas onto Europe, but that seems very, perhaps the more likely outcome, but very unattractive from a European policy perspective, because ultimately it still means that more Russian gas is going to a new market where it's earning them hard currency. And then finally, if Azerbaijan switched its own energy production resources to be less gas dependent. It is technically possible, but over 5 years, I think extremely unlikely. Part of the EU package was a pledge to invest in some of these renewable sectors in Azerbaijan. I do expect we'll see some support from the European Investment Bank and the like for those kind of moves, this global gateway, and Europe's own projects have called for more state-backed investment in these kind of structures. But over 5 years, it's extremely aggressive and highly unlikely. Azerbaijan, the Azeri government, has also spoken for many years itself about investing in renewable energy without it actually coming to shove. And then the question is really Azerbaijan's own electricity demand and therefore gas demand has been growing, and we've seen a lack of capacity domestically that has made blackouts more frequent in the country. I don't want to say they're super common, but certainly there have been a number. A few years ago, there was a major blackout in Baku that caused a lot of local reverberations. But if they were to increase these gas shipments along that level, that's where the most likely cuts would have to come from, which would mean that residents of Azerbaijan would suffer as well.
Mr. Hess, in the same foreign policy piece, you write, if the West abandons Nagorno-Karabakh to Baku, Russia's dominance of the South Caucasus will be solidified. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes. Well, what I was trying to say is I think it's very important that the West steps up and asserts itself as a security actor and as a diplomatic actor in the South Caucasus more actively than it has been willing to in recent years. We saw the West almost entirely absent from the most recent major conflict in 2020 in Nagorno-Karabakh, where Azeri forces took a lot of territory that theretofore had been controlled since 1994 by the local Armenian population. That because Armenia has security guarantees from Russia and as part of the settlement from this 2020 conflict brought Russian peacekeepers in to oversee the lines, it's an area where Russia can exert influence both over Armenia and over Azerbaijan. The Azeri government likes to try to paint Armenia as some simple kind of Russian puppet, DNR, almost level of control, when in reality that isn't true. At least in my view, the Pashinyan government has also taken steps to move Armenia, at least economically, closer to Europe, signing new agreements there, and has been concerned about the level of Russian support and potential Russian duplicitousness. I think that the Pashinyan government coming to power and its reform agenda after the long corruption and very much Russian dependency of the previous Sargsyan governments is a promise that means Europe and the wider West owes something to Armenia not to abandon them to such a fate. But really, what I meant to say is that the Azeri government feels that it has sort of a free hand to act in Karabakh, or at least that its hand is becoming more free because of its ability to, or its belief that it can paint the Armenians as just another front in the wider conflict between Russia and the West. Of course, if Azerbaijan were to escalate there, that's where I fear that Russia may use that as a pretext to expand its influence as well. Although Russia has sold a large number of weapons to Azerbaijan as well as to Armenia over previous years, it does have concerns about Azeri gas over the long term. It would be in a strategically better position if it could stop more of those going from Europe, or even decreasing the current level of supply. So, I think Russia is looking for potential ways to increase its positioning on the geostrategic chessboard, and it has shown a willingness and an ability to do so in the South Caucasus that I think the West needs to be very closely watching and needs to understand is not only a security concern for the local population, but is also a real important geostrategic concern in this wider economic conflict between Russia and the West. And an oversimplified understanding of it, or simply saying, the Azeris are on our side because they have gas, or this is not in Europe, it's in the Caucasus, it's too far away for us to worry about. These would be huge strategic blunders of the kind that have been made previously in Europe and have led to this situation in Ukraine, and that therefore should be most steadfastly avoided now.
Mr. Hess, thank you a lot for an interesting conversation.
Thank you so much for speaking with me. I really enjoyed it.